Good afternoon and welcome to the Jewel Collins Smith Museum of Fine Art at Auburn University. My name is Scott Bishop and I'm Curator of Education here. And all I really want to say is that we are so honored to be the venue for this important conversation. We feel strongly at JCSM that art museums can be a place where we open conversations for all parts of our culture. Besides that, I want to thank Dr. Taffy Clayton for being here to do the opening remarks, and please welcome Dr. Clayton.
Thanks so much, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. What an exciting time to be at Auburn University. I am so pleased to be here sharing time with you at today's event and to be a co-sponsor of this Becoming the Beloved Community experience. Today's intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and interfaith panel discussion commemorating the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death typifies Auburn University's focus on and support for academic collaborations across disciplines. Indeed, we in the Academy are able to explore and discover new insights as a result of examining ideas and issues through an interdisciplinary lens. And as part of today's experience, and as we are examining this topic through interdisciplinary lenses, we are also simultaneously reflecting on Dr. King's life, his dream, his death, and with diverse lenses, indeed, noting differences across time and across generation and across faiths. That's pretty exciting to me. I'm intrigued with the prospect of hearing perspectives about how Dr. King's values, priorities, his dream, his legacy translates into our contemporary context. And I assert that the lessons that we learned from Dr. King's life and his leadership, the movement that he inspired and led, and his dream remain relevant today. I am pleased to welcome Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, Senior Pastor, Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, and to acknowledge the presence of Auburn's own Dr. Wayne Flint, Professor Emeritus, Department of History, who I've had a brief opportunity to chat with, and certainly have had an opportunity to meet them both. They both are going to play prominent roles in today's experience. Lastly, I want to commend the co-sponsors for this event, this beautiful Museum of Fine Art that we have here at Auburn, the Center for Arts and Humanities, as well as the College of Liberal Arts. And certainly I want to thank Joan Harrell, Visiting Assistant Professor, School of Communication and Journalism, for her innovative approaches to designing such learning experiences for this enriched campus community. Welcome, and I look forward to the experience with you.
Welcome to this great event, to this great venue, and to the co-sponsors, besides the College of Liberal Arts and its Center for the Arts and the Humanities, the Office of Inclusion and Diversity, and the museum, which is hosting us. I am Giovanna Sommerfield. I'm one of the professors in the College of Liberal Arts and one of the associate deans for education affairs in the College of Liberal Arts. And I bring the greetings of my college and our heartfelt thanks to the organizer of these great events, and also particularly to Joan Harrell, who is in our college in the School of Communication and Journalism. We're here today echoing the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from I Have a Dream, because, and I quote, "We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We're here today because we believe that there is an urgency for justice. Dr. King reminds us that, and I quote again, now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children, end of quote. May we all live the dream Dr. King had and keep it as a constant reminder and goal. May we all become the beloved community. Thank you.
Good day, good afternoon. It is not by chance that we find ourselves in this space 50 years from the day after that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was taken away from us. With that said, I would like to bring to the room on Tuesday night in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ, the last pulpit where Dr. King gave the infamous mountaintop sermon. We were instructed as leaders, as scholar activists, as academics, as ministers, students, those who were invited to be in attendance. Ambassador Andrew Young asked each of us, as we prepared to leave our spaces, to continue the work. He said, I would like for you to remind the people, in my travels, and these are Dr. Young's words, he said, in my travels, and I've had the opportunity to travel to every African country, he said, I was always reminded that in the African culture, no matter what tribe or nation, it is believed and practiced that when a person physically dies, when a person transitions into the next world, if you will, yes, that person physically leaves us. But as long as we say that person's name, our beloved person is always with us. So it is in that context that I would like for each of us, after I say his name, I would like for you to repeat his name so that we bring, he's already here, if you will, depending on what perspective that you practice. But we'd like to bring, as Dr. Young asked us to do, Martin Luther King's spirit, his legacy in this room. So would you please follow me? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you. And as we continue in the legacy of Dr. King, no matter where Dr. King traveled, even if they knew that they were going to encounter violence, he always had someone to pray. And so today that person is the Reverend Dr. Wells Warren, the priest and chaplain of the Auburn University St. Dunstan's Episcopal Church.
Well, I'm a little confused. I've never been applauded for praying. I'm pulling your leg. I was actually thinking about how this week 50 years ago, I was 15 years old and living in Auburn. It was a very small and quiet and pretty town. It was a good place to grow up and to go to school. A lot of those things are still true. I carried a paper route, and this was actually the eastern terminus of my paper route. I would start up by Southside Grocery and wind up at the top of Woodfield Hill, where this large poodle terrorized me for years. And I was so glad that I was soon to get a car and maybe I could run over that poodle. No, I'm just teasing. Her name was Polly. Can you imagine a 15-year-old boy being terrified of a poodle named Polly? It does bring back to me an older time, but it also tells me how much things have changed for the better. There is freedom that we did not have then for all people. There is honesty that we are able to say our truth without fear of retribution. And here I'm speaking of people of color and people who have always lived at the margins, it seems, of the society that is controlled by people of advantage and entitlement. So, this day, I ask you to pray with me. Dear God, we thank you for the joys and wonders of your creation, the flowering, the blooming of nature, the beginning of spring, a time of hope and of possibility. We thank you also for the wonderful and infinite variety of human beings who surround us on all sides. And we thank you for their bravery and their honesty, their genuineness, and their love. We know that life is difficult, and that death is hard. And on a day when we remember the overwhelming grief of 1968, we ask you to comfort us from all that time ago and give us hope for the future, that children will grow up and be educated well, that young people will get to go to college and get the job that they want, that families will be able to live in peace and in security, and that all of us will continue to grow and to become what you would have us to be. This is a day that we count as a tragedy, but also within it there lies a blessing. And that is that the death of this most remarkable man, Martin Luther King, is not for us the final word, that he continues to live in us and for us and with us. All this we offer to you, O Lord, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
My beloved community, we will begin. As Dr. Moss and Dr. Flint, will you please join me? As Drs. Flint and Moss walk upon the stage, I would ask each of you to please, as we move forward, take into serious consideration the intentionality of our purpose for being here today. It is to discuss, are we becoming the beloved community? Is the beloved community in process? Did the beloved community die when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King left us physically? So if you would please focus on our purpose. Gentlemen, please follow me. So, Doctors Moss and Flint, the reality of our world that we live in at this moment is that 50 years ago today, one of the major newspapers, the headline read, "The drum major of justice is dead." Where do we go from here? So I began with a question. We are in a space 50 years later, 2018. The drum major of justice, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, transitioned 50 years ago. Where do we go from here? Dr. Flint?
It depends. There are two ways of reading the greatest speech, in my opinion, in the history of American oratory, which is I Have a Dream. First part of it is about the urgency of now. And we all live our lives, if we are moral people, in the urgency of now, because we all believe that the injustice we see all around us, the poverty, the discrimination, has to be resolved as moral people in our moment. But on the other hand, that can lead to a real high level of burnout, because you can spend your whole life battling these huge problems. And at the end of your life, if you are still an idealist, you feel, my life's been worth nothing. My fight has been worth nothing. The scar tissue is worth nothing. And if you don't believe that, you should have been teaching in the 1960s and see what happened to a lot of your students. Because they did not all come to good ends. So, in the wisest of all the wise reformers, there is the essence of what we have, and I Have a Dream. The first 4 pages, King repeats over and over again, now, 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 the urgency of now. And I understand that, and I believe in that, and I lived my life according to that. But at the same time, the last 2 pages are when he starts with, I have a dream. And if you notice, the same cadence is in the end of the speech. I have a dream. I have a dream that even in Mississippi, there will be justice. I have a dream that even in Alabama, my 4 children will know that little white children and little black children will sit down with little white children and boys and girls, and there will be justice. Well, that depends on where you are in Alabama in 2018, whether that's happened. As a matter of fact, you could probably argue that that's a long way from happening in Alabama. And so the question is his dream fulfillable? Now, I don't think Martin Luther King ever thought it would be fulfilled in one lifetime. That makes him an almost Pollyanna-ish, irrelevant person that you can dismiss by saying nobody in their right mind who understood Alabama would have believed that, and no one understood it better than he did. And therefore, we live in the tension of what is to be resolved now, and we give it all the energy and all the ability and all the strength we have. But if we expect it to be realized in our lifetime, we're naive. And so we always hold in reservation the prospect that, as one great Baptist editor of the Alabama Baptist put it, if truth does not rise from the tomb the 3rd day, it will the 3rd decade, or maybe the 3rd century, which is to say that justice is always out beyond us. And I think King, more than perhaps any other reformer of our time, has to be understood as balancing those 2 parts of reality. which is why I love that speech so much.
I would add, there is a poet by the name of Carl Himes who wrote in Vincent Harding's book, Martin Luther King Jr., The Inconvenient Hero. And the poet, and I paraphrase, it says, "Now that he is safely dead, let us build monuments to his name, because monuments do not require you to change." And there is a need for America to learn how to mourn prophetically, not pathetically, but prophetically. Pathetic mourning means that I fall into despair. Pathetic mourning means that I will not change a system. But prophetic mourning means that I take my energy, my anger, and my sorrow, and I put it into stretching our democracy. One of Dr. King's mentors, Howard Thurman, says it this way, that God places a crown above our heads. We will spend the rest of our lives growing tall enough to wear. And the idea of democracy, there is a crown above our heads that we will stretch, as Dr. Flynn says. It is not achievable in this generation, but we are to build so that the next generation can at least have a step up. And so for now, we have to learn how to, one, stretch, and not to move into pathetic mourning where we co-opt the name and the legacy of Dr. King so that it may be used by corporations to promote certain market-driven types of ideas instead of this radical, revolutionary, nonviolent person who disturbed America. You don't get followed around by the FBI unless you are a troublemaker. And J. Edgar Hoover stated that he was the most dangerous man in America because he believed in the beloved community. Now that's an interesting kind of, you're dangerous because you believe in the beloved community.
Dangerous, he believed in the beloved community. He was a faith leader. He was within the context of American religious pluralism, he was a Christian Baptist preacher, but he was dangerous. Dr. Flint, because of your own personal experience regarding racism, that intersectionality of racism and religion, you've written many seminal books, and I'm going to say more than 50 essays, if you will, talking about this issue. What are your thoughts about that comment?
I like what Otis said. Sometimes we forget that radicals are almost never people who come from outside of us and have not grown up like us and do not draw from the wells of wisdom from which we draw. The real radicals are the people who are inside us, who come from us, who think like us, who share our theology. A Marxist saying the same thing King said would have had no influence, because at the time King was saying this, the South was the most documented Christian part of America. And yet it had failed so completely in the realization of what the beloved community that Christ talked about was. And so the reason he was so feared by political leaders was that he didn't bring something outside of our culture. He brought the essence of our culture. And like many white people, I did not transcend racism growing up in Alabama by taking a sociology course. And I didn't transcend it by going to college, because I transcended it when I was 14, 15 years old. My problem was I was reading the New Testament. Now you're talking about something radical. How do you deal with the 25th chapter of Matthew when Jesus says, if you think you're going to be in heaven because you say, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ as my personal Savior, you haven't understood me. And when you get to heaven, the test, the final exam, the doctoral examination is going to be, have you fed the hungry? Have you given water to the thirsty? Have you cared for the widows and the orphans? Have you taken care of the prisoners and gone to see them? Have you taken care of the sick and provided for them? Have you welcomed strangers in the land? And if you say, I have, then come into the kingdom prepared for you. Why is it that we have just ignored that most radical of all statements about the nature of culture and society? If Marx had said that, we would have dismissed it. But when a Baptist preacher says that, it knocks us off our moorings. And we didn't know what to do with him because he was quoting Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Jesus and Paul, and we couldn't process it.
I love what you said, because one of the things that the church has done, and that Dr. King calls us to account, is that the church loves Paul more than Jesus. And so we will quote Paul all day long, but then we will ignore Jesus. And so there is a lot of preaching Jesus, but not preaching what Jesus preached. And that's a fundamental difference. And we were confronted, America was confronted with someone who deeply believed in the message and teaching of Jesus, and said, if you believe it, then this is how we are to engage in our democracy. The other piece is that, and he said many times, the veneer of Christianity, of religiosity, that's what happens in America. We have a veneer, and in many ways it is we are more capitalist than we are Christian, because capitalism allows you to separate your body from your mind and from your spirit. And that is how the evangelical faith over time moved from abolitionist to being privatized piety, to say what happens in the world has nothing to do with, because I've got a personal Savior, and what happens in public I could really care less, because my Savior's personal, I'm going to heaven, you can go to hell, is essentially how, that's a very truncated way of looking at it, but that's, that's the way some people frame it. And here comes a prophet from the outside and from the inside. I'm from the outside because I come from a marginalized community, and I offer a theology that is not the theology of the Southern Baptist Convention. I offer a theology that is not United Methodist, but has been Africanized, that sees that there is no difference between sacred and secular, and that is what Jesus says in Matthew 25. How are you going to make a claim to the kingdom of God, and yet you do me wrong? That's the OM3 version. Don't do the folk wrong. And that's the beautiful thing about Dr. King, is that he challenges us so deeply on a faith level and on a political level. His text is the gospel and the Constitution, and he weaves a sermon by living it, that we are called to account every time we face this very radical, inconvenient hero, as Vincent Harding calls him.
So what happens when a radical Christian, Baptist, African-centered minister not only introduces this moral compass using the text of the Bible and the text of the Constitution, but that intersectionality also touches the hearts, the minds, the souls, the pain and suffering of persons not only within the Christian community, but in the interfaith community, members of the Islamic community, Jewish community, Buddhist, Sikh, even atheists and agnostics. And we find ourselves here today, but when we reflect upon, we look at the historical statistics of poverty, racism, the ism of sexism, militarism, the statistics are basically the same. What does that mean?
Well, I think that this is one of those questions of process theology, where you must you start out with this deeply heartfelt, emotional connection to God, partly because of your family, partly because your extended family, community. It's more to realize that African-American churches in the South during the period King was growing up were not like Ebenezer. They were little country churches and often extended families. And so it was a community experience. And then from that community experience, you carry a theology off to some other place. And that some other place is sometimes a place like Morehouse College, or it's sometimes a place like Crozier Theological Seminary, or it's sometimes a place like Boston University. And when you get to that other place, all of a sudden your theology expands, it grows, because you're faced now with the fact people don't look like you, sound like you, maybe not believe entirely like you, but at the same time, you find in them something endearing, something compelling, something very secular. Profs at Boston University befriended King. And he's thinking, gosh, they're not such bad people. And so all of a sudden the world expands, and you can realize that someone who doesn't share your theological views at all can be a mentor, can love you, can support you. Not only that, but you begin to read, because you're forced to in comparative religion courses, and because you have profs who are Jewish, and you begin to encounter the fact that you have really good Jews who do not understand Christ as the Messiah, who are better people than a lot of the Christians you know. And that forces you to say, what's going on here? When we get to heaven, will there be Jews there? Jews like the ones I know? And then you have to process a whole different world. There's a great sermon that King preached he preached it like many of us who were Baptist preachers did. He preached it over 2 or 3 times when he was working on his doctoral dissertation, and Dexter Avenue, as you may know, hired him, and he was a hard bargainer. He was not only a hard bargainer on salary, he was the highest paid preacher in Montgomery of a church full of PhDs and staff and administrators from Alabama State University, but he was also a very shrewd bargainer, and he said, I don't have my dissertation yet, and so the first 6 months I'm not going to preach. If you can imagine calling a preacher who tells you, I want the highest salary, but by the way, I'm not going to preach for 6 months, I'm going to write my dissertation. So he's 2 or 3 months into this, and like all of us Otis who are under stress from our PhD programs and so forth, he has to preach, finally. Well, he recycles a sermon, and it was on worship, and he'd preached it at Ebenezer for his dad. It's really interesting because it starts off about Buddhism. And he says, it's not a real religion, but they worship. And they have incense. They do it their own way, but they do it. It's worship. And then he gets to Confucius, and he said Confucius didn't even believe in the gods. But as soon as Confucius died, his followers all over the world worshiped Confucius. So he said there's something tugging in our hearts that brings us toward the nature of God. And whether it's Confucius or whether it's Buddha or whether it's Muhammad, there's something that pulls us toward the other, what is not ourselves. I wonder how that congregation received that sermon. We're not unique, we're not special. We are part of this larger human experience of worship. And if they reacted well to the sermon or were just intellectually tolerant, I wonder how it would have gone down at Siloam Church out in the country. I have a hunch there would have been a lot of pushback. But you see, King, like all of us, was not just shaped by reading the Bible and the family we came from, and the church we came from, the Baptist college that I went to. But all of a sudden I went to Florida State, very secular, very different, but wonderful. And I opened myself to that, and there are 2 reactions all of you have to new knowledge. One is to open yourself and say that within the confines of my own values, I will appropriate what I find useful. And the other is to say that I come from a world in which all knowledge and all truth was bound up in what I heard and inherited, and I will not believe or change in any way. The King was open.
I would add to that, America is a remix culture that we take and appropriate from a variety of different sources. We love to think that we're so exceptionalist and original, but we're really not. And really there's only one kind of musical originality in America, that being jazz. And it really is. And all it is, we're borrowing from other people, just as, I say America is more of a gumbo culture. Take everything, put it in there, cook it up, and it comes out. King comes from that culture. And if I would use that as a metaphor, on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, many people don't know this, part of his education was not just Morehouse, it was not just Boston, it was this rich community where he had the opportunity to see different classes of people together. So his home is on Auburn Avenue, a middle-class home, and everything on one side of the street are middle-class homes. But when you go down Auburn Avenue, you will then see on the other side shotgun homes. So when he comes out of his house, he is greeted by the domestic worker across the street, and then the person who's the doctor on the other side of the street. When he walks to his father's church, he then has to pass by several restaurants owned by African Americans. There's a wonderful church called Wheat Street Baptist Church, William Holmes Borders, and this housing unit that was created. All of these people streaming from very different locales, going to these different houses of worship. So what the domestic deals with is very different from what the doctor deals with. What the person who is working in the factory locally in Atlanta is very different from the lawyer or the person who's publishing the Atlanta Daily World. And so he had all of these voices, and they were synthesized when he came into his worship community, and then moving to Morehouse, and then to Boston, and to Crozier, and then to Boston, then on to Dexter Avenue. He had a world experience from his small experience in Atlanta. Because when you are an outsider, in order to survive, you have to know how to survive in multiple cultures. So any black person at Auburn knows how to function in multiple spaces. Every woman knows how to function in multiple spaces. And so that is one of the part of the power. And the day America learns how to function in multiple spaces is the moment that America shall be America.
Amen. Did I get that right, Otis?
You got it right. You got it right.
Gentlemen, let's talk about, each of you had the opportunity, as each of you do frequently, to write in public spaces outside of religious venues. So each person in the audience should have received a copy. If you have not, make sure that you receive a copy of 2 articles. One is an article, one is an op-ed piece. Dr. Flint, and I'm going to say in this space, I think it's safe to say that, can I share this story, Dr. Flint,
Sure.
about The Economist? Well, in this process of finding out that we would have the opportunity to have this 2-day program, months before actually talking to and inviting Dr. Flint to participate on this day, which would be the day after Dr. King was assassinated 50 years ago, he had been approached by The Economist to write a piece about Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy. Hence, we find ourselves here. So tell us about your piece, which you start out, which is very interesting, which you didn't know, Dr. Flint. Zora Neale Hurston is one of Dr. Moss's favorite writers. So how did that happen?
Mine too. If you have not read Their Eyes Were Watching God, you've not read one of the greatest novels ever written. And don't say it is one of the finest novels written by an African-American woman, because I hate that. It is one of the greatest novels. And she was Baptist, and her father was a Baptist minister. Not that I'm proselytizing. She also was born in Notasulga, Alabama, more than likely, although she created her own identity, so she denied that, but she almost certainly was born in Notasulga. There are a lot of us who, when we get out of Alabama, deny that we ever came from here. But I was asked if I would write an essay on the theology and homiletics of Dr. King. The person who asked me to do this is a dear friend, Andrew Miller, who covered the South for The Economist for many, many years, and we got to be very close friends. Andrew is Jewish. His family came from South Africa to East London, which is like coming to Brooklyn or Queens or Harlem 100 years ago. It's the other New York. They were working class people, small shop owners, peddlers. He is a first generation college student. He went to Cambridge, so he's pretty smart, or he wouldn't have gotten in. He is, by religious preference, an atheist. And so when he decided that he wanted this 50th anniversary article, we had talked religion on my porch for a long time and compared notes and had our differences. And he said, I don't understand Dr. King. I don't understand. To me, it's pie in the sky by and by to talk about the dream. And I said, yeah, a lot of Christians view it that way. That's the problem, is that heaven talk can be escapist. But it wasn't for him, but it can be. And he said, well, I want you to write this. And I said, okay, but he said, well, how are you going to approach this? And I said, well, I'm going to approach it two ways, both of which will cause concern from some of your readers. One is when you talk about Southern or American evangelicalism, it's really important that you distinguish whether you're talking about black evangelicalism or white evangelicalism. Right. Because 81% of white evangelicals in the United States voted for Donald Trump, which was the highest demographic percentage of any group in America who voted for Donald Trump. And the largest single group of American Christians who did not vote for Donald Trump were African Americans. In Alabama and many other states, it was 98 or 99% voted for Hillary Clinton. And yet, if you take this argument theologically, Andrew, the African American church is the doctrinally most conservative church in America. On many social issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, it is often the most conservative part of American evangelicalism, but on matters of politics and economics, it's the most liberal part of American political culture. And he found this just totally, I can't believe this. This is just messes my mind up something terribly. And therefore, to speak to a secular audience about a religious subject, and especially when you're talking about the homiletics, I started off the article by saying, well, there are at least two Dr. Kings. There's the Dr. King of Crozier and Boston University and Dexter Avenue, and there's the King who grew up in Ebenezer and went to Morehouse and spoke at Holt Street on the 5th of December when he was introduced as head of the Montgomery Ministerial Association. He was the new guy in town. He was full of himself. He had a Boston University PhD, and he was flattered. And what he didn't know was that E.D. Nixon, the civil rights leader in Montgomery, knew that there was a good chance the Ku Klux Klan would assassinate whoever became head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and the older, wiser black preachers wouldn't do it. And so when he was asked to do it, it was not a compliment. It was basically everybody else saying, if somebody's going to die, let it be Martin. He's full of himself anyway, and so let him be the one who gets killed. Well, when he preached that sermon at Holt Street, he had 20 minutes to prepare. Right. And his last sermon, he just winged it. So there is the king preaching the worship sermon at Dexter Avenue, and there's the king with 20 minutes preparation at Holt Street. And there's the King in Birmingham at the beginning of the Children's March when he had a big rally in an African-American church, and the parents were there, and the parents are thinking, I don't like this. And they knew they would be fired if they protested because white people control all their jobs. But how are you going to fire the kids? So, King, you get the kids out there. But the problem with that strategy was that the parents didn't want the kids out there. And so his job was to convince them. And so he riffs, to use that jazz analogy. He riffs. He watches them, and then he begins to talk to them, and then he begins to preach to them. And before long, he has them shouting and waving and saying, get out there, kids. Because he is processing this through the reality of the moment, which is his genius. Anybody can write a sermon if they're smart and have 14 hours and look up all their material in their commentaries. But King's genius is when he didn't have time to do that. And when he was watching the faces like any good speaker does, and he's reading the faces, and they begin to talk just a little bit, they begin to say it again, say it again. And then they say, that'll preach, that'll preach. You know, unfortunately, when I preach, that doesn't happen in the white church. They don't help you out at all. I'd be a lot better preacher if they'd help me out. But Dr. King preached to them, and they preached to him. That's genius, pure genius.
And that comes out of, again, that jazz narrative. The improvisation only happens through preparation. Some people think that improvisation just means you're just making up something, but it means that you have deep preparation. So every jazz musician knows the chords so intimately, practices the chords over and over again, so that they are then able to, in the moment, draw from the preparation in something new. And Dr. King learned that from, there's several people that he learned that from, but one is William Holmes Borders. William Holmes Borders was this magnificent large figure in Atlanta, at the Wheat Street Baptist Church, and he had this incredible poem that he used to preach at the close of his messages. It was called, I Am Somebody. And he would say, I'm somebody like a Booker T. Washington, I'm a builder of institutions, I'm somebody like a W.E.B. Du Bois, I write the souls of black folk, I am somebody like Zora Neale Hurston, their eyes are watching God. I mean, he would go through this whole thing of, you know, throughout the ages of I Am Somebody, and King would creep into the balcony after he finished worship watching his dad to hear William Holmes Borders. And then when he went to Morehouse, there was a professor by the name of Samuel Williams, who was a philosophy professor, where Dr. Williams would press the students with these philosophical questions they could not answer, and they didn't know who was going to be picked on that day. But you had to, in that moment, to be able to, you might have to just explain the Republic, or you might have to defend a particular position. So there was this practice of improvisation through preparation. And he developed that practice over and over and honed that practice, because Holt Street is one of my favorite sermons by him, because it can only be understood. And Vincent Harding, when he puts together his Eyes on the Prize Reader, which is a wonderful document, they include not just the message, but they include the call and response in the transcript. Because his thing is, you can't understand Dr. King until you know the call and response, because the sermon is a community event. So and there's one tape I heard Dr. Harding, I took class from Dr. Harding, and he was also the editor for many of Dr. King's writings that he would edit for him. And he had us listen to the Holt Street sermon. He said, listen very carefully right here, because you could hear in the background someone was near the mic, and Dr. King was going on talking about something, very theological, was using some words, and you could hear this person say, I don't know what he's saying, but it sure does sound good. But again, he was sharing the power of the community coming together. The community developed Dr. King. He does not come out of nowhere, it just drops into the world as if he is an alien. But he was nurtured in a very unique, powerful, spiritual, intellectual environment that allowed him to be the prophet that would be transformative in this country.
Otis, I had a most interesting experience. Never really thought about this until this morning, but there is the written article in The Economist, which is back there, and people can listen to the sermons. Some of the sermons are recorded, and so you can, but most people don't do that. They read them, and they'll read The Economist, and The Economist actually has a media division, and they have a podcast. So they asked if, and they didn't know about this, and in fact, I first told them I didn't know if I could do this radio piece, this podcast, because I didn't know the time. Well, because of the time difference between London and here, they wanted me really early. So WEGL, our university radio station, actually opens at 8 o'clock, and they said, well, that'll work. So they taped me this morning, this conversation like we're having here, and suddenly it dawned on me when they said, could you read this? And I read it. Now it's on the page in The Economist, but here's what I read for the radio. My friends, I want to be known that we're going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses of this city. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer that never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. Love has no meaning, and we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. That makes a difference. And if you read this in The Economist, you're going to say, didn't know that. But if you hear this preached, you say, I'm going to change the world. And those 5,000 people, Otis, changed Montgomery. That's right. And America.
That's right. Dr. Moss, in this context of changing the world, your piece starts out speaking about Bayard Rustin, who was, I'm quoting from your piece, Quaker, gay, and a believer in the power of people organizing for change. And you go on to address the fact that he was an organizing mentor and teacher for Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer throughout the movement. Why did you choose that language to begin your piece?
Oh, I think it's very important to understand that Dr. King was a part of a community. He had mentors. And Bayard Rustin was one of his mentors that others attempted to get him to deny or denounce, and he refused. He said, I know he's gay, he's still my friend, and he's taught me more about organizing than you have. And so he refused to push Bayard Rustin aside, who was a Quaker, who was gay, and he was one of the primary organizers for the movement. Then you have Fannie Lou Hamer, powerful woman from Mississippi, who has this deep abiding faith, but yet she didn't graduate from Jackson State, and she didn't graduate from Ole Miss, but really is the one that should have been the dean of all studies for the entire state of Mississippi, since she educated everybody. But one of the things that I learned from my parents, who were they met in the movement, is that men, though might have been in the forefront, but the majority of organizing was by women. When we look at the case that was brought by the NAACP for the Montgomery Improvement Association, we always lift up Rosa Parks, but we do not remember Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin, and the reason that she was not listed at first is because Claudette, was not considered to be the perfect kind of class candidate. But they had 5 women 5 women that the NAACP brought before in reference to the Montgomery Improvement Association for the boycott. And no men would sign on. And here was the reason. 1, the men were afraid they would lose their jobs, number 1. Number 2, they were also fearful of the way that they would appear, that their names would appear, and that other people would, in the community itself, would look down on them for whatever reason. There was just this real, fearful, cowardly, machismo kind of thing going on. But we forget that. And so 70%, as I've heard, 70% of the organizing was done by women. And it needs to be lifted up, too, that not everyone organizing was considered to be a straight male. I think that's important, too. So you have, when you're talking about beloved community, they were practicing it in organizing. And I find that very fascinating, that we want to hide these facts today, and we want to marginalize certain people. And that's what's so powerful, that what we see with the March for Our Lives and the Women's March and the Black Lives Matter, that you have young people that are taking up the elements of this and saying that wherever you come from in the community, that there is a common goal, there's an intersectionality that we have to fight for and collectively work together to build this new nation that is yet to be built, that is yet to, or I like to say, as Du Bois says, the yet to be United States of America. That we are not yet the United States, but it is a dream, a vision, that one day we will grow tall enough to call ourselves the United States of America.
So when Dr. King announced or introduced the vision, his vision, which he coined, the beloved community, it was actually on the date that the Montgomery bus boycott movement ended. And during that particular social, economic, political moment in history or herstory, we lived, the words that were presented in media was black, white. But today, 50 years later, our social, economic, political, religious landscape is inclusive, it's diverse, it's not limited to black, white in the context of colorism, but we hear Asian American, Islamic, we hear Sikh, we hear Middle Eastern, that's a whole nother discussion. So what is it realistic to say that we can begin to work towards trying to reach the crown of the beloved community within the context of inclusion, diversity, and interfaith?
Oh, if I didn't believe that, I don't think I could survive. If I did not believe there was the possibility of the beloved community. Is that not what our whole lives are about? Is that not the reason we teach? Is not that the reason that we become doctors and nurses and social workers? If you believe it's impossible to change conduct and to change the trajectory of history, then you might as well just go ahead and die. What's the point of your life? What's the meaning of your life? It's to be what the president is, a narcissist, a hedonist, and a materialist, the new trinity of America. That's what it's all about. And so, to some degree,
Write that one down.
I'm sorry.
That one down. That's good. I'm going to use that on Sunday.
Well, I'm trying not to be political because I'm a Baptist preacher, but that's all right. My view is that King did exactly what every Christian ought to do. He said, the Lord Jesus confronts you now, where you are, and he commands you to follow him and do what he would do and do what he says, not what Paul says, but what Jesus says, including the 7th chapter of Matthew where he says, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall also be judged. Judge yourself, don't judge other people, which creates a real problem for Paul, I think, Otis, but he was busy judging other people, not himself too much. But the truth of the matter is, Jesus also taught us that in your lifetime, the world won't be made perfect. And this is the kind of apocalypticism that says, in the end of time, the kingdom of God will be here. But I do not for a moment agree with some of the most radical advocates of the social gospel that we will create the kingdom of God in our lifetime. I don't think that's going to happen. On the other hand, Dr. King was not escapist in that he said, well, we'll wait till heaven and Jesus will make it all right. So the tension of those worlds is the tension that every person in this room lives in every day of your life. The tension of do it now, and the tension of knowing if you do it now and everybody in the room does it now, it still won't be perfect. But you know, we're a lot closer than we were when I first had these ideas in the 1950s. Think how much closer we are. These black people would not be in this room.
I wouldn't be here.
You wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have been allowed in Auburn University.
That's true.
So if you say, well, nothing's changed, oh, you couldn't have been in Alabama all your life and think that nothing important has changed. And nobody knows that better than African Americans who live in Alabama.
One of the things that I think that has to be attacked in America is what I call the social construction of race, or the racialized imagination. There's a wonderful writer, many of you all know her, by the name of Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison recently did lectures at Harvard, and it was entitled The Origin of the Other. And in her lectures, and she talks about, not only in the lectures and in an interview with Charlie Rose, where she says that she has attempted to place, especially black women, in the center of her writing. And she remembers the first time she got a review from Sula. This is Toni Morrison, Toni Morrison, Nobel, everything. She's got every literary award. And the reviewer writes about her article, Toni Morrison, because I think about critic and Toni Morrison, like all you could do is just say, thank you for what you wrote. That's about all you can do for Toni Morrison. I mean, she's brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant. So the critic says, she will be a better writer when she learns to place more white characters in the center of her story. She said she kept that review because she wanted to be, it motivated her in many ways. But what she went on to say in this origin of the other is that America loves to other people, to create an other group, otherness, and create a hierarchy where one group has privilege and another does not. And early on in America, there was no idea of race. It was based on ethnicity. So people of African descent were either called Africans or black or whatever. And people from Europe were defined by their ethnicity. And so after this Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, where black folk and indentured servants from Europe got together and said, hey, the problem is the guy in that big house over there. Let's deal with him. And so slowly we start seeing what David Roediger, the sociologist and writer from University of Illinois, he calls the wages of whiteness, where he says, I'm not going to give you any money. I'm really not even going to give you any land, because this thing is about landowners in the 1700s. But I will give you the wage of being white, so that you can say at least you're better than or have more privileges than these Africans over here. So you will keep your eye away from the 1%. Keep your eye away from the Mar-a-Lago people and all these individuals who have power, so that you will not build coalition. And I think that when we begin to break down those constructions, and that's what the beloved community, that's what Dr. King was doing with the Poor People's Campaign, to say that whether you're in Appalachia, whether you are in Georgia, whether you are a first world indigenous person, whether you are Asian or Latino or Chicano, we have some commonality in terms of how we structure and build a nation where everyone has not just only opportunity, but where we can see the imprint of the divine upon every spirit. And that is where we are in this moment. Shall we deconstruct some things and allow us to maybe lift up culture, but we can also cast aside race at the same time? And I think that that's going to be a big challenge for us, because we always mix culture and race together. And there's a difference between someone's color and someone's culture.
Gentlemen, let's open it up to the floor. So, of course, when I said let's open it up to the floor, the first person who raises his hand is an educator, an academic, Dr. Peniskovic.
I think this notion of love really came from the Greeks, because Greece is an island, and when people came to the islands, they came up with a point word called barbaros, barbarians, because they weren't free. And I comment that Dr. Wood, I think you touched on it when you said this, but I'll make it more explicit. When you speak about the beloved community, it's really an eschatological idea. That is, it has two elements to it. It's a present reality, but also something that's going to happen in the future. And there's a tension between these two. In fact, most of the key terms in the Bible are eschatological in nature, including the notion of the kingdom of God. And there are certain texts in the Bible that speak of the kingdom as already present with Jesus, but yet still to come in the future. And the full kingdom will come to the end of the time, And I think there was a French exegete at the turn of the century, the 20th century, who said Jesus preached the kingdom of God, and we wound up with the church.
No, you were right about, in reference to the Greeks, that talking about the barbarism, but what is unique in America is the idea of a biological connection, which we now define as race, and that's social construction. And so that's unique. That is the poisonous gift that the Enlightenment has given to the world. The idea that now it is biological. In other words, we would call it the epistemological violence. The idea that on your body there's something inherent in your body that is evil, in your body that's something wrong with you. Not your region, but the very fact that when you come out the womb, that there is something wrong with you. And that is something that we will have to erase. But you are absolutely right, because I'm trying to remember, Ibrahim Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, which won the National Book Award last year, deals with the intractability of this idea of difference, and then moves into talking about the idea of race. You're absolutely right, so I appreciate that.
No, it's not just in theology in the Bible and historical culture, it's also in American mythology. That is the mythology of the self-made man, the self-made woman. If you go back and look at the robber barons in the late 19th century, they had an unusually high level of education compared to most Americans, and they started off with their parents giving them money. They inherited money. Most of the robber barons were not self-made men at all. And yet we have this mythology, and of course the people we say we most admire are the people who, quote, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, first generation people and sorts of things like that. But in reality, if you start looking at the way things work, a 3-4-year-old in Alabama in a very poor family, white, black, or Latino, or Asian, it doesn't make any difference, who does not have an early childhood program. And, you know, and we live in a state which is among the states that have the 4 best states in the union for early childhood programs, as measured by all sorts of academics. One of them is Alabama. But not too long ago, only about 20% of Alabama children who were 3 and 4 were in those programs because we didn't fund them. Now we're up to a little over 50%, which is great. But the truth of the matter is, you know and I know that if your 3 or 4-year-old is in a class with my 3 or 4-year-old in a family with parents who have PhDs and all that. They don't drop out of school when they're 17. They drop out of school when they're 6. Because they sit next to somebody and they think I'm dumb because I didn't know that. I didn't know about the colors and I didn't know how to draw and I didn't know any of this stuff. And so you just assume that you don't know anything. Well, the truth of the matter is that runs against the grain of the American mythology that you don't have to know anything, that America's a land of opportunity. Well, yeah, it is some places for some people, but it never was for African Americans. It never was for Hispanics. If you were a white immigrant and you came from Europe, it was a land of opportunity, but otherwise it was not. And so what we've done is gradually squeezed the life out of public schools, public universities that were open to first-generation students. We don't have state-supported universities. We have state slightly-assisted universities, where it'll cost a family $150,000 to $200,000. And the families don't have that. And so the kids wind up in debt, which they pay off in their 60s. And so we created a mythology that relates to an America that probably never was true. It was just mythology then, and it's certainly mythology now.
Yes, Dr. Emanuel, from Macon County Ministers Council, yes.
I agree with you completely about the mythology because it speaks to a very tangible problem that we have of disparity. So, you know, from the very beginning, whether it's that child that's 3 years old or a 6-year-old or a 17-year-old, based on where they are and what background they have, whether they are majority or minority, there's going to be disparity. And the disparity is so well documented in so many areas, whether it's education or economics or whatever the case may be, that they're automatically behind the day they start. You know, they're not able to really catch up. And I know as a pastor, one of the things that I have to deal with on a regular basis is helping the people in my congregation, which is a minority congregation, deal with the disparity, how to cope in the midst of the disparity, because they know, for example, that their child may make A's in school as a minority, but in some ways, it feels like their child's A plus is the same as a minority, is the same as a majority child's C plus. You know, so there's a disparity there. Or when their child goes to buy a car, they're going to pay more than someone in the majority. Or if they go get a job, they're going to make less than someone in the majority. And so there's this constant feeling of, we live in a constant feeling of recession. You know, it's not something that's new. It's because of the disparity. And so with that in mind, it makes not only that we have to do spiritual work, but we have to do social work as well to try to help deal with those disparities and encourage people to not pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but to keep pressing, knowing that you can do better today and that preferably you'll do better tomorrow if you just keep going. So that's, you know, one of the things that I think we deal with a lot, you know, in the context of that mythology, because now mythology has gone even a greater extent for minorities. We're seeing a lot of young minorities who are thinking, I need instant pie in the sky. I need to be the next American Idol. You know, I need to make it to the NBA or the NFL, or I need to become a music artist so that I can be somebody, because they don't see how they can succeed in the daily life of academics. They don't see how they can succeed in the daily life of promotions on jobs and career paths. So there are some issues that we're still wrestling with that I hope over time we can do better.
That's brilliant. And I would just, to put this in an institutional setting, Tuskegee in your hometown, an incredibly wonderful school in terms of taking people where they are and letting them go. Auburn here, 20 miles away. And when I came to Auburn, in the history department, of course, I came from Birmingham, which was in the midst of a lot of social change. But the interesting thing about it is the difference between an urban population of African Americans in the 1960s and rural populations, which were still terrified of the possibilities of what could happen to them if they got out of their place. You were protected in Birmingham. You were not protected down here. We had 3% of us African American students when I became head of the history department. And I was looking at the admission requirements. And the admission requirements were pretty much standardized scores. You know, 18 on the ACT. If you were below 18, they basically didn't look at you. And I thought, now if we want African American students, we need to do for them what was done for me. Because I was from a working class family. No one in my family had ever been to college. They didn't know how to tell me what to do, what to take, and so it was a smorgasbord. I took what I liked, and a lot of what I liked didn't prepare me for college. And a lot of what I didn't take would have prepared me for college, and we didn't have a counselor at the school. Besides that, I went to 12 schools between 6 and 14 because, like most poor white families, we were moving all the time. And so when I took my standardized test, I did terribly. But on the other hand, I had a great work ethic. I was very goal-oriented. I was incredibly focused. I felt God had called me to preach, and if I was going to preach, I had to have a college degree, so this was God's work for me, and I had to go to college. And so my school, Stanford University, Howard College it was then, gave me a chance because they were not real strict. They just wanted live bodies to pay tuition and to pay the faculty, and so they let me in, and there wasn't much requirement one way or the other. So in Auburn, I said, well, what is there about 18 on the ACT that is so magical? Because if there had been an 18 ACT, I wouldn't have gotten in Auburn. When I was 17 years old, I wouldn't have gotten in Auburn. And so the faculty began to argue. The faculty had a conversation, overwhelmingly white faculty. And the leadership of the faculty said, why can't you have a sliding scale? That if you don't make 18 on the ACT, but you had straight A's all the way through school, then you don't have to have an 18. All of a sudden, we go from 3% to 7%, from 7% to 10%. And having had a lot of those African American students who wouldn't have gotten in, they had the greatest work ethic. They were scared to death, just like I was, terrified that they were going to humiliate their families. They wouldn't be able to preach because they weren't going to get a college degree. And so by work and by dedication and by single-minded focus and by delayed gratification, what they did is they graduated from Auburn University. Sometimes with C's and B's, but sometimes in my classes with A's. They were great students, but they just needed the opportunity that we had and that is a part of that American mythology. And so what I keep arguing is if you believe that American mythology, that all those immigrants who came like me or like you against your will, that if you get a chance that that's what America's about. America's not about what you bring here. America's about giving you the American dream, the dream of Dr. King, and opening the doors of institutions, and then what happens to you can be determined by your hard work and your focus and your delayed gratification and your discipline. But it's not, they don't turn you away at the door because you have not had the opportunity. And you know what we need is more faculty in universities now, which we no longer have, of first generation students who themselves went to college. And you know how you get them? You hire more African Americans and more Hispanics, because that's where you get first generation college students who go on and get their PhDs and come back to teach. We're becoming more and more elitist on the faculties, and that bothers me.
We have time. I see two more hands, sir. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. I think I met you in the hallway. Is it Seth? Okay, yes, okay.
I want to ask Dr. Flynn his comment about the children of PhD people being in class and being sitting next to a disadvantaged person and how the disadvantaged child would drop out of school at age 6. I would have thought that it would be the opposite of that the disadvantaged kid would gain something from being around somebody who had kind of like you don't improve in sports, they're like in tennis, unless you're playing somebody better than you are.
Yeah, the question was basically, isn't it true that sometimes if you're around other people, it helps you, even if they're smarter than you are? I don't think that's true. It certainly wasn't true in my case. I was intimidated. Every time we went to a school where everybody had been there for 6 years or 8 years, the same schools, and they always had friends, I felt like an African-American kid coming into a white school, but it was different. It was not the color of my skin that made me different. It was the fact that kids have networks. Kids have social programs. And if you're 10 or 11 or 12 years old and you've moved 6 times already in your life and everybody already has their group, I always felt insecure and the outsider. And so I think what we have to do is find a way in which, for instance, early childhood programs are built around neighborhoods. And then neighborhoods have to be like neighborhoods in Auburn, not like neighborhoods in Hoover and Homewood and Mountain Brook, where they're sanitized by class. But the minute you get in there, you will discover that there are some little black kids you really like and some little black kids who are bullies you really don't like. Well, that gives you a possibility of integrating yourself into the social dynamics of America. You don't have to like all blacks. If they're bullies, don't like them. And if they're white bullies, don't like them either. But on the other hand, my boys both went to all white schools in Birmingham because of neighborhood segregation. When they got to Auburn for the first time in their lives, there was one high school. Everybody in Auburn was in that one high school. 35% of the kids were African-American kids. And my sons found that there were some black students who became their good friends. So I really think it's critical that you get in a situation where the opportunity of meeting people unlike yourself is there. But on the other hand, it can be daunting if you come from a background like I came from, and then you wind up in a place like Auburn, and everybody's the son or daughter of a college professor.
I would add, you used the sports analogy, and I coach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade girls basketball. And I think it's important to know when you use the sports analogy that coaches will work with those who have weaker skills so that they can develop stronger skills. Within the school system, we cast aside those who have weaker skills. We don't use, if we had a coach's model and a coach's heart, and a lot of teachers do, but many times there's so many students, you end up focusing on those who are strong and cutting those who are weak. And that's really what happened. We've yet to learn from sports. Every good coach is saying that I have to be able to strengthen my team. I have to work on the weaknesses so that they cannot be exploited by our enemy or the opponent. And that's one of the things that we really have to learn in our education system, that where there are weaknesses, we have to strengthen our students, strengthen our children, so that they will not be exploited by those later in life that seek to utilize our children as commodities and not as human beings.
One other thing I want to add to this too is that if you understand the dynamics of what it's like to come from a poor family, if you go to college then, say you get a scholarship and you go to college like I did, and then all of a sudden you've got choices at the end of that, because even though my GRE score was so low that I barely got in Florida State, they required 1,000 on the GRE and I made 1,005. And I had the lowest score of anybody coming into my PhD class, and I was the first one to finish, and I've been the most productive one in terms of scholarship. I don't say that to call attention to myself, but I suggest to you that success is not based on native intelligence all the time. If I had taken one of the other fellowships I had to Duke or to Vanderbilt, much less to the Ivy League, I wonder if I would have been successful. Or if, in fact, that would have put me in a social setting and with a background where I would have been totally intimidated by all these brilliant students who had made so well on the GRE. And therefore, don't diminish Tuskegee University or Alabama State by saying, well, these really aren't very elite schools. They may not be. But what they may be is the best possible place for a kid who's like me, insecure and not terribly prepared, and certainly not with many social skills. And if you send that same kid who might have been a summa cum laude at Tuskegee to Harvard, if you look at what happens to those kids at Harvard and the Ivy League schools, it is not good. It is not good. They get chewed up. And they get chewed up because they're competing with people from 5 generations of wealth and power and legacy admissions to college and social skills. And you know, it's entirely possible that at 21 at Harvard, you can feel like a 3rd grader sitting beside a group of Auburn University professors' kids in the early childhood program. So the great colleges are the ones that take you where you are and take you to where you can be, not just the ones that admit you and then you become the jetsam and flotsam of a school that considers you to be the weakest student they've ever had in the PhD program.
Your statement makes me think about a book that was required for my students in literary journalism. Everyone should read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. It's a great example of that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go one more question. I think I recall seeing Dr. Johnny Green, Vice President of Student Affairs, and then I'll make an announcement, and then we'll hear the last words, if you will, from our guests, my conversationalists, conversations partners.
So I'm going to change gears a little bit and go to the world of politics. Wayne knows that all. I wonder if in light of our topic, becoming the blood of religion, does the election of Doug Jones portend anything different for Alabama?
Johnny, I'm so glad you asked.
Hold up.
I had a reporter from the Financial Times who came, and I had a reporter from the largest newspaper in Sweden that came. And I remember the repetitive comment. First time I talked to them, they said, well, Doug Jones has no chance. And I said, I give him about a 35% chance. And they said, oh, I don't. Of course, Rachel Maddow was saying, anybody that thinks Doug Jones can win is an idiot. Which says maybe you shouldn't watch MSNBC for all your opinions. But at any rate, the last time a reporter came, it was Andrew Miller's replacement covering the South for The Economist, and he was brand new, and he was headed down to Gulf Shores for a Roy Moore rally. And he went down after I talked to him, and he said, do you think Doug Jones can win? I said, absolutely. I said, as a matter of fact, this is 2 weeks before the election. I said, I think he's got a 50-50 chance to win. This is after the pedophile charges and so forth. He said, well, you must be kidding. I mean, it's not going to make any difference to Alabama voters. And I said, oh, yeah. You don't understand religion in Alabama. I said, number one, a lot of white evangelicals are going to stay home. They're not going to vote, which is exactly what happened. And I said, not only that, but an awful lot of African Americans who never vote in special elections are going to vote. And a lot of suburban women with children are going to vote. And a lot of millennials are going to vote, and they never vote. None of those groups ever vote in large numbers in special elections. So I couldn't resist Johnny calling the reporter from The Economist. And he's out of Atlanta, so I thought, well, I'm going to get him in Atlanta. But I got him in Finland. He was in Helsinki, Finland, and I woke him up, which was even better. And I said, you remember I said that Doug Jones had a 50-50 chance? Well, he won 50-50. He won by 20,000 votes. And he said, you're kidding. And I said, no, I told you. I said, next time, instead of trying to bring educated, elite, European and mainstream American political values to Alabama, understand we are the most ornery group of people in America. We don't care what anybody tells us, including Donald Trump in Pensacola, Florida, 3 days before the election. We will make up our own minds on things like this. And so I was not surprised. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those women who were my former students and from one end of the state to the other running for the state legislature and probate judges, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them won this time.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're out of time, but I like to be a radical in this respect to make the announcement before we hear the last words, if you will, from the two of you. So please remember that at the end of this session, there are refreshments and beverages for everyone going out into the outer area here in preparation for our next session. And we will continue our discussion, our engagement of becoming the beloved community. So with that said, gentlemen, let's hear your last words. As Dr. Andrew Young said the other night, where do we go from here?
I just have an irreducible faith in people to change, and I think that was at the core of Martin Luther King. I think he had faith in the amazing capacity of transformation. And if you don't, I would suggest that you never have a 2 or 3 year old child. Because if you judged the life of your 2 and 3 year olds to be what they will wind up being at the end of their lives, you would get rid of every one of them. And I just really do believe that there's no better place in Alabama to break down on an interstate. And the person who will probably change your tire or fix your car is an African American, because whites wouldn't stop to help you. And that's where you create brotherhood and sisterhood, is out on the interstate late at night, and the person who stops to help you.
I still believe that, as a country, as a nation, that love and justice are central to who we shall be, and that we have to work on it every single day, that it's a struggle, and we should never be afraid of struggle. We need to think of our nation. We need to operate like Grandma in the garden, that she's just going to be out there working every day, not that the plant is coming up tomorrow, but she's waiting and excited for spring. And if we keep on planting, keep on taking some of the manure and using some of it, it can actually grow some great things in this nation.
And on that note, thank you to both of you. Thank all of you.